ISS to Houston, this is Commander Diaz. Do we have any debris close to our trajectory?
Evening, Commander. Negative on that. Clear sailing as far as we can see down here. If there was any cause for alarm, you know we'd see it too. Your crew members can keep sleeping tight.
Well, I'm seeing something out there. I can't make it out, but whatever it is, it's getting closer.
Tell you, Commander. We're not getting...
Houston, repeat again. It can't be.
Diaz, copy. Commander Diaz, do you copy?
Houston, you're not gonna believe this. I'm picking up transmissions on the ham radio that sound identical to the suit-set experiment. And that debris, it's an Orlan spacesuit.
I'm not sure I'm hearing you right. Repeat that, Commander?
Suit set. I'm seeing suit set.
You're mistaken, Diaz. Suit set re-entered the atmosphere and burned up years ago. It's impossible.
Yeah, I know it's impossible,
But I know what I'm saying. It's suit set. It's come back. And it's not just in orbit. It's headed right for the ISS. You're not making any sense. Say that again? Commander. Man, you need to try
Up here, the sky is black. Up here, the sky is black. Up here, the sky is black.
I need to alert the crew.
Diaz. Commander Diaz, do you copy? Diaz.
Hey folks, it's the season of giving and time for more free marketplace content. Get ready for your grand opening with over 300 models in a hospitality pack, build your secret hideout using modular Gothic temple pieces, and adorn the world with beautiful stylized environment assets. Then hop through complete platformer set before driving away in your brand new stylized truck. These assets are available for free through the end of the month, and you'll be able to download this hand-painted environment as part of our permanently free collection. Head to the UE Marketplace now to collect them all. Are you looking for more game dev resources? During Unreal Fest 2022, experts from Epic Games and the community offered practical training and shared illuminating insights on a wide range of topics, from building open worlds to keeping asset dependency chains under control. Head to unrealengine.com/UnrealFest2022 to watch all of the sessions on demand. For you audio aficionados, we've shared a roundup of presentations from GameSoundCon 2022, the largest audio and sound design show for games. Discover what's in store for the UE audio engine, how game devs, including Epic, use Metasounds in their projects, and more. We've been asked on more than one occasion, what is augmented reality? Well, we've put together a handy article to explain just what augmented reality, or AR, actually is. Head to the feed to learn the basics, what AR is used for, how it works, and much more. From Squanch Games, the studio founded by Rick and Morty co-creator Justin Roiland, High on Life has been described as Blade Runner meets Jim Henson. We caught up with several members of the studio to find out their inspirations for the comedic cosmic adventure, how they designed their talking weapons and companions, and beyond. The first project brewing up in our community spotlight this week is from Epic Mega Grant recipient Alchemical Works. The action RPG Battlejuice Alchemist adds flask drawing to the classic RPG formula. Set off to explore the wilderness, learn ritual magic, solve riddles, and craft potions to fight demonic hordes. Wishlist Battlejuice Alchemist on Steam. Next up is this beautiful industrial sci-fi and modular oil rig from Sierra Division. This pack was created in the hopes that one day we may no longer need oil rigs, and this model could serve as a memory of the journey taken to preserve our planet. A portion of every sale of the oil rig pack will be donated to the Ocean Conservancy. Head to the marketplace listing to learn more. And capping off this week's roundup is a beautiful African fable of sisterhood, envy, and ancient evil from Miguel Ortega and Tran Ma. The Voice in the Hollow is a love letter to 60s and 70s westerns and horror films. Watch the complete short, and then be sure to check out what they've shared from behind the scenes. Thanks for watching this week's news and community spotlight.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Inside Unreal, a weekly show where we learn, explore, and celebrate everything Unreal. I am your host, Tina, and today with me I have two of the best victors around, but for the sake of keeping things separate for chat, let's start with Fi. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hey, so I'm Fi, I'm Victor as well. I'm the lead engineer at Voxel Plugin. I actually created the company a few years ago, and I do all sorts of engineering stuff at the company. And then we have Guzi, who helps me make sure that I don't spend a few months building something absolutely stupid that's useless to our users.
Yeah, so basically Fi's the brilliant engineer, and then I'm the person who needs to make sure that we can actually still pay our employees because people like the decisions we're making. So I handle operational stuff. I talk to people. I make sure the engineers are doing sane work that we can actually use instead of, that's a neat tech demo. How are we ever going to use it? So that's my job. So shall I just roll straight into my presentation with that?
I think we can. Before we do, I have one announcement that I totally blew past because I'm the worst. But just in case anyone didn't notice, we have a little URL down in the bottom of the screen here. If you would like to have captions, you can now have captions. You just have to go to that URL. We'll also be posting them in the chat throughout as well. And you can pull that up on your phone or next to the stream, wherever you want it. Just know that that's available if you would like to have them. But yeah, now with that, we can dive right on it.
Cool. So I have a presentation. If we can switch to my screen, there we go. Yeah, so presentation title, Digging Deep Next-Gen World Creation Workflows, which sounds nice and snappy. Realistically, it kind of comes down to just, we made some cool tools that we're happy about and we want to share them with you guys. So we're going to start with a quick video just showing some of the work that has been done with Voxel Plugin so far. That includes a bunch of stuff from our old version, 1.2, and then one or two things with the new version already. So I'm just going to show that so you have a frame of reference. Then we'll do a little bit of present-y stuff about the technical background on how, what the plugin is and what problems we want to solve. And then we're going to dive into practical showcasing and we can answer questions and stuff and we can just talk. So let me tab into the video and then we will hit play. Okay, that was an absolutely super riveting video, which I'm sure you all deeply appreciated. So, time to dive into the actual meat of the presentation. I just wanted to put a little bit of nice-looking visuals in there before we start talking about boring tech stuff, because otherwise everyone will leave. So, yeah, we're a Voxel plugin. It's kind of probably relevant to talk about what voxels actually are. So we have the term pixel, and a voxel is essentially a pixel, except VO, which stands for volumetric. So it's in 3D instead of in 2D. So Voxel plugin for handling 3D data. Generally speaking, in games, it's used for referring to, rendering style or how you handle terrain rendering and that sort of thing. We focus on the terrain rendering side of things, but we also handle like general volumetric data stuff. You can render voxels as literal cubes because, it is a grid, so you render it as cubes by default, but you can do clever stuff on it and use that volumetric data grid to render it into nice, smooth shapes. And that brings you from a Minecraft style look to just like super nice looking, smooth, realistic style terrains. And there are loads of techniques and clever things for that, which is what these are. And then this is a showcase of how you get from the spatial grid to actually a mesh. And it's super complicated and something that we handle for you, so you never have to think about it. So the reason you'd use voxels is because they're just super powerful compared to traditional height field terrains. Usually you have in-game a height field terrain, which means for each XY point, so for each horizontal point, you can have a single height. What that means is you have really straightforward data to work with. Whenever you need to do something about your terrain, you just check like, hey, at this position, what's the height? And then you're done. Voxels let you do caves, and they let you do overhangs. They let you do, because they're generally more built around fast computation for specific bits of the world and that sort of thing. Height maps tend to be built around static solutions. Voxels tend to be built for more runtime dynamic things from the get-go. They open the door to actually having interactive worlds rather than purely static ones. The big downside on voxels is that, when you have a 32 by 32 meter chunk on a height map, that is 32 by 32 data points. When you have a 32 by 32 by 32 volumetric grid, suddenly the amount of data and computation that you need to do went up by a factor of 32, or sometimes even more than that, because you now have like bottlenecks on memory and stuff, which you'd never run into with height. So it's depressing, and you don't want to work with voxels because it takes a lot of headspace to actually make those solutions work. So that's what we do, so you don't have to worry about it. So interactivity, cool terrain shapes that normally you'd have to hack together solutions for, make a little mask hole in your landscape and then block it out with cliff meshes around it so you don't see that you carved a hole in a mesh and then manually place cliff meshes along the entire length of your cave. It's a pain. Don't do that. Just dig a hole and it works. So a couple of example games. This one everybody will know. There's Minecraft. Minecraft is, a point per grid square, and each point has an ID. It can be a certain surface type, it can be dirt, it can be sand, it can be grass. That's like the most coarse representation of voxels, and when you go into half blocks and stuff, it gets more complicated, but at its essence, Minecraft is probably what most people think of when you say voxels. Realistically though, there's a lot of stuff that uses voxels, which is more like Astroneer. Astroneer is an open world survival game thing. It's completely procedurally generated. You dig around in the world, creating big holes, exploring cave systems, finding resources to build a space base with. This is a very different style. This uses a terrain generation system, similar to one of the ones that we support in the plugin. And same kind of core data, really, really different kind of result. 7 Days to Die, zombie survival game, probably pretty well known out there as well for the kind of voxel stuff that it does. You can dig in the terrain, which is fairly smooth, but you can also build the buildings, which are built with like actual blocks, like Minecraft. So that creates this really interesting dynamic where you have different kinds of voxel structures interacting with each other. Just Cause 3, probably not very well known as a voxel game, but Just Cause 3 with the skydiving benefits a lot from having interesting terrain shapes. So they have overhangs and caves and that sort of thing, which you can wingsuit through. The fact that you have that instead of just a basic height field terrain makes it way more interesting to be flying through the landscape. And they wouldn't be able to do it without voxels, because authoring that stuff would just have been a royal pain in the ass for the development team, and it wouldn't have been worth the hassle. Planet Coaster. This one's probably fairly obvious. You sculpt your entire theme park. You want to be able to do that so you can make it look nice and build the attractions around it, powered by Voxels. We ourselves have been used in the industry already by a couple of people to solve these kinds of problems. In the first place, we've been used by Core, which is made by Manticore Games. They're essentially a game creation platform, a social platform where people can hang out, make their own creative experiences, and share that with other people. Their terrain solution is powered by Voxel Plugin, so they can let users deform the terrain in their experiences, but also create super pretty maps with this sort of foliage for their fellow players. Then we have games like Hydronia, kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. Hydronia has been made by a small indie team, and it's a game about digging for resources. You grab little chunks of dirt, you process them, and then you get resources out of them. Lets you buy machines, you get more resources, you can dig more, you can dig faster. In the intro video, we had a little thing where you have a machine just plowing through the terrain. Interactivity, that wouldn't be possible without Voxels. Severed Steel is a super cool and out-of-the-box example of how you can use Voxels. This is actually a really cool project that I'm quite excited about talking about usually. Everything in Severed Steel, other than the NPCs, is Voxels. So just everything you see on screen here is completely destructible. The runtime environments are manually authored using super clever tooling that was designed by the team on top of Voxel Plugin. And you can shoot through everything. You can blast through things with explosives and lasers and stuff. Super high-paced shooter. It's really cool how the destructive environment completely changes how such a game plays compared to the usual shooter mechanics. So in Severed Steel, every single bullet is an edit on the Voxel worlds. There's probably hundreds of edits happening in some of the worst frames, and you need to be able to handle all of that in a consistent frame time because it runs on the Switch. And if anyone here has ever developed for the Switch, they will know that that is not a fun thing to do, but it runs consistently. It supports RTX and all that, collision, nav mesh, because you have the AI running around it. Supports all the standard stuff that you need to support to be able to actually make a game. Astro Colony, cool space building game. Terraria set on Voxels, again, for the interactivity and that sort of thing. Opens lots of cool doors for just manipulating the world around you rather than it being static. And then lastly, this one I'm quite excited about as well, because we haven't ever really talked about this so far, but the Park Beyond game being developed by Bandai Namco and Limbic Entertainment is built on top of Voxel Plugin for its terrain, so it solves the same kinds of problems as Planet Coaster, but it uses the plugin instead. So that's super cool, and I'm really excited to see that go out into the world and to see what people create with it, because we're really happy with how that's been coming together. Can't show anything cool about it yet, because they need to do that first, but I am happy to be able to talk about it now. So, with that rapid fire of lots of Voxel pictures out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the tech. In the past, we had a workflow comparable to Unreal Engine landscapes, where you just have a data set and you sculpt and then you save it, and that's what it is. And then if you ever want to make edits or you want to remove the edits that you did, you just kind of have to redo a chunk of the map. What we've been trying to do instead is move to a brush-based workflow where things are non-destructive and you can just play around without needing to redo large chunks of work as you change your mind on how you design your worlds. So what we're doing now is, instead of having you manually sculpt every little cave, you can use a mesh brush and say, I want to stamp this mesh over here. And then it stamps it into the terrain at runtime. And then you go, actually, I want it to move a little bit to the right. And you just select it and move it a little bit to the right. And now it'll have moved a little bit to the right and nothing else will have changed. This also extends to things like, I want a mountain over here. So you put a mountain mesh or height brush over there, and you put a whole bunch of other meshes on top of that mountain, and then you go, actually, this mountain needs to go 10 meters to the right because I want a house at the foot, and I don't have enough space to put it there next to the road, so the mountain needs to scooch 10 meters. You move the mountain with all of the brushes attached to it 10 meters, and it just works. Doing that brings a new level of flexibility to world authoring, because traditionally when you look at this sort of thing, you have these stages in level design, But as you get into the later stages of polish, you can't go back on the decisions you made in the beginning anymore, because there are too many resources that have been spent getting it to a high level of polish. And you'd have to redo all of that if you wanted to make little adjustments, like moving that mountain over 10 meters. But because all of this is non-destructive and completely independent of each other, you can just say, we're moving this brush 10 meters and everything else stays the same, and it works just fine. On top of that, we are sticking with the existing graph stuff that we've been doing in 1.2. So rather than having a static like code thing that you need to write, where you need to actually understand how to write that sort of shader code to be able to generate a world, we have a nice graph UX thing where you can just put nodes together like Blueprint and generate a world that way. We have gone from having a bunch of stuff in the graph in 1.2 and a lot of stuff being in the code backend to having literally everything in the graph in 2.0. So there are a lot of things that used to be possible with the plugin already, but you'd need to dive into C++, whereas now almost all of that sort of stuff is exposed within the graph, so you can just do everything yourself instead. So that opens lots of doors for just using the plugin flexibly, and that means that you can use procedural generation to fill holes in what you're doing really easily. So you can put down a mountain and have that override the base procedural terrain, but everywhere where you don't have a manual brush, you can just like have some hills being generated with trees being generated on top of them. And then you might go, right, but this bit of procedural forest I actually want a little village in, so then you put down a brush which clears the forest there and puts down some other terrain features, and you put the village there, and that's now manually overridden by the manual edits, so you don't have the procedural stuff there, which means you can have the procedural generation just filling the gaps. You don't have to do one or the other. You can do manual what needs to be manual, and you can do procedural where you don't need things to be manual, which significantly speeds up world creation flow. This kind of talks more about what I've already been talking about, because these slides were a little bit inconveniently placed relative to each other. But we have 3D brushes for actual volumetric data. But again, volumetric data is expensive and kind of a pain to work with. So we also have 2D data. You can just have a height map, turn that into a brush, blend that in with the surrounding terrain. We now also are starting to work on a new framework where within this same non-destructive frame of reference, you can have edit volumes. So you can say, dig a hole in the terrain, and then say, actually, this hole I just dug with manual sculpting tools, I don't want that to exist. So you can delete it entirely, or you can move it 10 meters to the left. You can like sculpt out an entire cave and then go, actually, I want to move this cave to this other mountain where this dungeon fits better. And that just works. We haven't made that yet, so that it just works is a little bit speculative. But we have some really cool ideas on that front, and I expect it to just work for the most part. For the most part. So that's really cool. But what that really means is that we have this really wide spectrum of use cases that we can cover, from fully procedural to fully manual and everything in between. And because all of this is just pure data flow and it's exposed in the graph, that means that you can also say have a brush and have that affect foliage or materials or something like that. It's not just I put down a mountain over here, so there's a mountain shape. It's like I put down a river spline over here, and around that river I am painting dirt automatically, and then around that I'm also spawning reeds automatically. Because all of that data is available to you in the graph, and you can do whatever you want with it, because the foliage and stuff is also spawned from that graph. So everything links into each other seamlessly however you want. So we're quite excited about that. We also, this is kind of a quick mention because I don't have a demo of this at the moment. Fi might be able to show a little bit of it later, I'm not sure.
Maybe, yeah.
But we have Minecraft-style block rendering. This is not like super well supported at the moment because we developed it kind of a year ago and then have been sort of maintaining it but not doing super much with it recently. It should work in the current plugin release, but we haven't been using it extensively and there's more work to be done on it. But it exists, it works in conjunction with everything else, and again, because it's based in that graph, you can have smooth terrains and the cubic terrains simply coexist. So cubes are a thing. You can render Minecraft-style terrains, and again, all the same workflow stuff still applies. You can still use landmass brushes, hypermap brushes, manual edits, all that sort of stuff works exactly the same because all that matters is how you use that data in the graph. So that's my rant almost done. And then we go into just a quick licensing. How do you actually get the plugin? How do you use it? We have 3 tiers of licensing. Free has limited features, but is representative of most of what the plugin can do. This is not available for 2.0 yet, because we haven't properly released 2.0 yet. The 2.0 free version will be more fully featured than the 1.2 one was. We can't go too much in depth on that yet, because we haven't made the plans concrete yet. But we really want that to, as much as possible, be a full representation of what the plugin can do, just with a little bit less, a few options less, rather than really a hamstrung version of the plugin like it was in 1.2. Then we have Pro, which is $350. I think I'm just going to go ahead and say that our plan for that is to keep that per seat for small indie teams. Again, sorry, not per seat. That's a bad slip up. That's exactly what I meant to not say. That will continue to not be per seat. So if you're a small studio that doesn't have a lot of income, you will pay $350 and you'll be able to use it for the entire production without needing to worry about additional licensing fees. For larger studios, you should reach out to us because you probably want more of a safety net than just here's the code, have fun figuring it out. So reach out to us and we'll have a chat and we can see what we can do. Plugin as it is available on the Unreal Engine marketplace. All of our existing 1.2 customers will be upgraded to 2.0 when we move to a full release, and all of our existing 1.2 customers have access to the 2.0 beta, which is currently available through the plugin downloader on the marketplace. If you guys are curious about giving that a shot if you own the plugin or are looking to own the plugin, go to docs.voxelplugin.com, so like documentation, docs.voxelplugin.com, and there is a post on how to install the plugin using the plugin downloader, and then you get the latest beta and you can start playing around with the fun stuff that we're about to show. So yeah, if you need us, there's the email address. You can also join on Discord and just send me or via DM. Preferably only do that if you actually have like business inquiries, because we have a lot of stuff to do and we kind of don't have the time to go through 1,000 DMs. So we will ignore non-business stuff on that front. And then let's actually dive into fun practical stuff where I can show you, how the plugin actually works. I think that is it for all the slides. So then I can Alt-Tab. My voice is actually starting to die because this is a lot of talking.
Yeah, it can be a lot.
Yes, it's fun. I always forget. I do this more often and I always forget. Yeah, this is Voxel Plugin 2.0. See, this part of the show should be a little more chill for me. I should be talking less intensely because right now I was trying to get through a lot of information and now I can just like show pretty stuff and take a second to breathe in and show the sights. Because we can actually make some really cool, pretty stuff with the plugin at this point. So this is a project that I've been working on, where, let me just, for funsies, show you how fast the world generates. So if we consider that that mountain is something like 8 kilometers tall, and this is probably also something like 8 kilometers, and the distance to that mountain is probably something like 50 kilometers. And now I will refresh it. This is actually slower than I usually have it be, because I currently have 2 threads allocated to the plugin just to make sure that we have super smooth performance with the streaming and stuff, because I don't want to drop frames. But this is with 2 threads. You allocate 4 threads, this will go twice as fast. It's great. It's also worth noting that this includes all of this foliage. So like this foliage stuff is generated for kilometers. It's quite a lot. So you can just fly around and then you wait barely a minute and then there it is. Or just updates. So what's cool about this is that this is actually a guided procedural world. This isn't just me having made a graph and saying generate some mountains in some places. If I grab all of these, and then I can find my gizmo, I can do that, and you will see the mountains disappear, and then reappear in
I
other
want to increase the
places.
number of threads.
Yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm not happy with this.
10 should be totally fine for like OBS.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a lot better, isn't it? It's worth noting that a lot of this is also going to be more and more GPU accelerated as time goes on, so then it's going to go even faster than this. And again, I do want to reiterate, we're talking about like editing stuff on a scale of lots and lots and lots of kilometers at the same time. This isn't small bits of the world changing a little bit. So the fact that it works at all is actually pretty neat. But what this means is you have full control over where each of these mountains is. So if we go over here, for instance, and we go through this list until we find the brush that is more or less over here. Come on. You'll see that that ridge that was just there just like moves along and goes wherever we tell it to. Now I can raise that up a little bit if I want to make it more intense. And now I have a ridge there instead of over there where it was originally. Now there's a second brush there, so there's still a little bit of a remnant of a hill. But what this means is that you can just super easily go, actually, I want a second ridge. Let's duplicate it, drag it off to the side a little bit. And now we have a second ridge over here. So now we have this cute little valley. Because of this sort of stuff, you get to be super powerful with how you design your worlds. You can, imagine you have a religion in your game and they venerate the sun, and you want to have like a temple location where at sunrise the sun perfectly shines in, and at sunset the sun also perfectly shines in, and it has sun all day round. But you have a mountain next to it, so that needs to be perfectly coordinated with how the sun actually moves through the sky so it doesn't get shadow. That's a pain in the ass when you're working with a hype map solution, traditional, or well, not even hype maps necessarily, but just more traditional workflows where you have static data. Because you need to go back and re-author a large chunk of your world manually to move stuff around if things aren't quite right. Whereas with this, I can just go, oh, my sun rises over there, my sun sets over there, so let's just move this mountain a couple of 100 meters to the right, and then it shouldn't cast shadows on this specific spot in the map anymore. So this opens a lot of doors to how you can flexibly iterate on your world creation and really create flavor within the scope of it. So that's something that always really excites me. Something I want to show in the same vein, and hopefully it'll work. This has been a little bit finagly for me to get set up the last couple of days. Mainly because I haven't had a lot of time to actually get it working because I've been writing lots and lots of documentation. But in theory, this map will let me sculpt these mountains using a brush. So I can just go around. I do actually need to be near origin, sort of, so I need to make sure I'm in the right spot. Yep, that's fine. So if we go into play mode, auto generate. I do feel like the stream is actually making this go less fast than I'm used to. Which makes sense because it's a low priority task. And then we do this. Yeah, this is definitely slower than it was. That's definitely slower than it was. Holy cow. Okay. Well, I pressed a button and now there's a mountain. So that's neat. Let's try that again. It's a little bit janky because, like I said, I haven't had the time to do this properly. So that means I have had to do this without a character controller. So the only way to move the camera is by restarting and starting in a different position. But hey, that sacrifices you make. So let's draw a little mountain. And now let's wait for that to actually catch up.
I like how you
So we
keep
drew a
talking
little
about this
mountain.
like it's so slow. It's incredible to me.
It
It's
is.
just a couple seconds.
So yeah, so Tina and I were actually talking about this a little bit earlier already when we were just having a chat about the plugin as a whole. But we tend to lose sight a little bit of how fast things actually are because we just spend every day with this the entire day. So for us, you know, this is slower than it was this morning. So I'm annoyed because this is slow. But the reality is, I'm still just like painting a mountain several kilometers across with all the foliage on top of it, going down to like grass and little rock details on the cliff. I should note this is not updating right now because I am in play mode, so then it locks to the player camera instead. But if we just go here, like this all just works. So this mountain is just here now and generated at full detail. How this works is in the graph, I have a mountain biome and a non-mountain biome. What you see around this is the non-mountain biome, and then this is the mountain biome. And I paint into a weight, and that weight just says at this location, the weight is this. So we lerp to the mountain instead of the hills, and then things pull up. And once you play around with noise cleverly and stuff, things start to look pretty good. So what I'm going to do from here is I am going to go back into the other map. And we're going to go have a look at the graph. There's actually one fun thing
other sectors as well.
Yes, that's part of the graph plan. So one fun thing that we have here, and for this I'm just going to get rid of the foliage for a second. So this is the world without foliage. And that looks generally pretty good. It's not like terrible. It looks a bit dull and empty without foliage, but it's a good base terrain, considering, again, this is kilometers and kilometers. We can, however, get rid of detail textures, and you will find that this becomes quite depressing of a blob. So, like, that mountain is no longer that great. Whereas if we have it like this, you can actually like see the snow caps and stuff. You can see the shapes within the mountain. If we look this way, it's a little bit easier to see because we don't have the light going against the camera. But like the terrain just becomes a smooth blob. But with the detail textures, we keep all this super crisp detail in distant terrain, like the ridges on the mountains. Once you zoom in, obviously that falls apart because it's like kind of a janky texture representation. It's not a clean mesh. But the reality is that when you're at this distance, it doesn't matter in the slightest. And it gives enough high frequency noise and detail that your brain goes, that looks nice and crisp. Because it is actually an accurate representation of what that mountain looks like. If we go closer and wait for it to regenerate, you'll see that that does line up with the shapes that that snow has on that mountain. It just isn't quite as high resolution, but the shapes stay consistent, and it's enough resolution to make you not notice that it's becoming less and less with distance. Whereas if we look at just, the triangle density on that, that goes to that. There's definitely a lot more going on there. And again, if we just get rid of it, it's utterly depressing. So detail textures are super cool. This is something that can run on the GPU. So you don't have to have these textures in your RAM or anything. They just live in VRAM on the GPU, super optimized, super fast to compute, completely separate feature. Like this impacts nothing other than the detail textures on your GPU, effectively. So it's super flexible. You can easily remove it, disable it, or make it scalable by just reducing the resolution a little bit. So that's a super cool feature, and one of a set of really big improvements that we've been able to make to the visual quality that the plugin can produce compared to what we had in 1.2. But at this point, I think also compared to stock landscapes, because we've always had a big negative mark on the plugin compared to landscapes when it comes to distant terrain fidelity. Because with height maps, you might not have the mesh resolution, but you can always still sample that height map in the texture and just go, okay, this is what the surface is supposed to look like, so we'll provide some normal details and stuff. with Voxels, you can't do that because you have too much data. So it's quite a hard problem to solve. So at the same vertex density, Voxels looked way worse than landscapes do. But now that's no longer the case, and the Voxels just actually look incredible, which is pretty neat. So with that little mind bath on detailed textures being cool aside, this is the graph for this thing, which is quite a lot to unpack, so we're not going to do that. But I have a couple of things here which I can fairly easily add. So I need to reorganize it a little bit because it's a little bit of a mess compared to what it was supposed to be. So we have these nodes here. Landmass brushes are very originally named after the landscape landmass stuff that has been implemented in recent years at this point, I guess. These are our non-destructive brushes that you can place in the world as an actor and move around and then move around some more and then decide you want to get rid of them entirely, and it works together with everything else. It works together with procedural generation, it works together with other manual generation, and it's just these nodes in the graph. So you can completely decide yourself in what order you use them as well. So whether you want A to override B or B to override A is all up to you, just depends how you use it in the graph. So in this case, we have our height map mountain terrain being generated here. That's like all of this stuff. And then that turns into height. That height gets turned into density because we're working with voxels. So rather than working with a height field, we need to turn it into a distance field to do stuff. And then we have these landmass brushes, which are also a density. So what we can do, and then the graph freezes, of course, because I have some outdated nodes in here. This is something that Phi will hopefully one day fix for me. And then we will do this. And now, in theory, hold on, where's that gradient defined? This is important. Where am I setting that? Yeah, definitely not in the right place.
The joys of the spaghetti, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big graph. Everything working okay still? Yes, good. Okay, awesome. We have a landmass actor here, which, yeah, there we go. We have a preview. Yeah, there used to be a castle here, but then some noise seeds changed, so now the castle is buried inside the terrain, which is sad for that castle. But if we turn this into a brush, we now have a sphere. And, you know, so far that mainly just looks like a height sphere type thing, but we can put a sphere on top of the sphere. And again, note how quickly this updates. I mean, it's a bit janky, obviously, because you see parts of chunks updating. But this is, I think there's a 3-meter sphere, and I have it on scale 60. Yeah, so that's like 400 meters across. And it just works, which is pretty neat. And then we go here, and it just works. And one thing you'll notice is that it's actually smoothly blending into each other. So we have this smoothness parameter here. And if we set that to, say, 1,000, you'll see that they really start to bleed into each other very smoothly. The same goes with the base terrain underneath it. We can make that smoother and smoother. So this is in world units. So right now I have a smoothing area of, I had it on 1,000. That'll be 10 meters. So 10 meters will be how big of a smoosh it does. If we just add an extra 0 in there, that's now going to be 100 meters relative to a 300-meter sphere. And you see that it gets this super nice transition zone. So now start thinking about what happens when you have just like a mountain peak brush. So say you have a mountain like this, but you want a nice peak shape on it. You can try and manually sculpt that or something. That's a massive pain. You could put a mesh on top of it, but then you need to make that mesh blend with the peak. But what you could also do is just take a peak mesh, turn it into a landmass brush, and then stamp it on top of there. And because we have this smoothness, you can have that perfectly blend into it. So we can actually try doing that. I think I'll have some mountain meshes in this project. I'm not actually entirely sure. I'm just kind of like throwing this out of my sleeve, so roll with the punches. But I think I have stuff. So let's pick something nice. Let's try. I have lots of Cinti assets in here, in case anyone's wondering what these are. Yeah, so I think I've been using that one in the past. So I'm not in landmass mode. Yeah, so that's a nice thing that we've done. By default, you drag a static mesh into the world and you place a static mesh. You can hit Alt-V to go into landmass mode. So now if I drag the static mesh in here, it instead just creates a landmass brush. Now this is tiny by default and writing to the wrong layer because you can have these be on as many layers as you want. But now we have a big mountain thing. Now that might be a little bit too big, but at least it's doing a nice smoosh. And you can really see actually here how this is already blending with like this line, this ridge line over here is part of the original procedural terrain. And then we add it here, and it just super smoothly blends into it, and it just melds to become this single unique shape. So it becomes an incredibly powerful and flexible way of authoring unique stuff within your world. And obviously, this is a janky mountain mesh with a skirt around it because it's designed to be like used as distant terrain and stuff. So it's not made for this purpose. Ideally, I would have this mesh and I would cut away all of this stuff around it. I just have the peak. I don't have that, so we have to use a little bit of our imagination to imagine that we don't have that thing around the side. But nonetheless, I can just make a cool peak. And this supports non-uniform scaling, so I can be like, I like this, but it needs to just be a little bit taller. I can do that. And then I can decide in a couple of minutes, you know, actually that mountain peak looks kind of janky, let's just get rid of it. And this won't impact anything. This will work with Foliage, this will update everything else around it in the world, and it won't affect anything because everything is completely separate. We have the base procedural layer, which is, you know, just the hill terrain. We have the guided procedural layer, which is these brushes that create the mountains using procedural logic, but using manual weights. And then we have the completely manual layer on top, which is the landmass brushes, where you just place stuff and have it right into the world directly. And then the fourth step, which we don't have yet, but which will be coming and is super cool and going to be really flexible and powerful on top of this for things like caves, is, you know, the landmass style manual edit volumes. So the way I can move around and scale around the landmass volume like this and rotate and stuff, imagine that, except it's your edits. So you sculpt to the cave and you go, this cave needs to move over a little bit. And you just move the edit volume and it applies to a new spot in the world. So now I need to open some notes, so bear with me, because I want to make sure that I'm not missing things. So I've shown detail textures and I've shown landmass actors very briefly. I will at some point show them a little bit more extensively.
Do you want to show a subtractive version of the landmass actors? So make a cave or something fancy like that? To really show what you can do.
What I'm going to do in a minute is I'm going to make a separate new graph and use that just as a clean slate. We'll do a little bit of noise and then start working on top of that with some brushes, because then we can walk through the entire graph framework rather than only here's a magical graph that does stuff. Because this is a bit of a black box, I'd like to make it a little bit more visual.
Sounds good.
And then I can also like demonstrate how you actually can work with the landmass data cleverly to do anything like foliage or whatever. I need to make sure to show foliage clusters, which is something that I will also show right now just on a basic level. We will also reuse these once we're actually back on making a graph. But it's worth showing in this context because it's like really grounded in this world. You'll notice that when you're at a distance here, rather than having a uniform scattering of trees, we have these pockets of trees. And the graph isn't doing anything in that. It's not like we're doing clever noise generation and then saying, you know, we have this noise pattern where it has higher density in some little bits of the forest. This is just a uniform density. It's placing trees every X meters. But instead of placing a single tree, it is placing a tree cluster. So we have these, which are really cool. They use the other foliage assets, which are like the normal foliage assets that you would use on a landscape as well. They're very similar to that. but they need to work with our own system and our framework, so they're a bit different. But then you have the clusters, and they reuse those. And you say, I have a big birch type. That's these meshes with a couple of instructions for scaling and random rotations and specific rendering settings. And I want one big birch, which spawns at the center. So minimum radius 0, maximum radius 0. And I have a couple of small birches, which is any of these 3 meshes. And those I want 6 to 8 of. And I want them to spawn 5 to 12 meters from the center. So you'll see we have a big tree in the center, and then these small ones around that. And lastly, we have these undergrowth thingies, which are just these small saplings and the ferns. We have 60-ish of those. Again, 0 to 1300, we want those closer to the big one as well. Those just need to be uniformly everywhere. What this does is we can say, usually to get a nice dense covering in a forest, you'd need a tree, say, every 5 meters. But then you just get this uniform distribution. So what we do is we put 10 trees in a cluster, and because in nature, small things grow around big things, which grow around even bigger things. That works for trees, that works for rocks, that works for grass, heck, that works for animal, creature structures, how animals interact with each other in biotopes. That's just kind of an ongoing rule within natural systems. So things grow around each other, which means that just using spherical logic, saying this thing grows this far from the origin of this cluster, and having a big thing in the center, and then progressively smaller things as you go farther out, you get a really nice natural representation of how foliage grows. And then we put one of those down every 25 meters in this case, and we get this really nice organic distribution where you have little pockets of foliage everywhere, rather than just a smooth blanket with it looking the same everywhere. Now I'll concede, a super dense natural forest will look like a uniform cover. In this case, actually generally, uniform forests are not fun to play games in because they're boring environments. This is way more fun. You have some places where you can't see stuff because your sightlines are blocked. You have some places where you can see stuff because your sightlines are clear. You have way more natural emergence in how the world works around you. So this is way more entertaining, and the system facilitates that. But if you want, you can also do a uniform forest distribution. You just change your clusters a little bit. You make them a bit denser. Heck, we can do that just to demonstrate that we can. Let's say, no, not 100. That's a little bit much. Yeah, and now the editor is being a little bit sad because I'm rendering more than 10 million foliage instances right now. But the point is, this looks like a uniform forest now. So we just added a load more trees, and the system can do it just fine. I have distance field shadows, which are becoming a little bit intense because they're configured for a lower density of trees. But, this works, and now you have a forest, which is neat. And this looks really good, and it runs just fine. So, yeah, just wanted to show that, because it's a different way of handling foliage. And it creates...
Do you want to change the instance count, just to give you an idea of what it does? Is just that preview?
I can do that. Yeah, I'll just show that in the preview status. So right now, the cluster looks something like this. Say we increase the amount of small trees that we have around this dramatically. So let's say we increase this to 16 instead of 8, and the minimum to 12 instead of 6. We now have a lot more of those. And it's lagging because it's updating the entire voxel world in the background. Then we can be like, well, but now we have a bit too much density on these. So we just also increase the radius of them a little bit. And now each of these clusters has gotten a little bit bigger. We can also say, well, now we want a couple more of these bigger ones in here. So you say 2 to 3 of these big ones, with a spawn radius of, say, 200 to 400, so they're always a little bit apart. Let's do more than 400, 200 to 800. So now you have this way bigger cluster, and you get a really different growth dynamic out of this. You still have a pocket of trees, but now instead of feeling like a single tree that started sprouting. It feels more like a mature stand of trees that happens to be growing out into its neighborhood. So based on how you use the cluster logic, you can create dramatically different results. And what's great about it is that you have the exact numbers you want. So as an artist, it's super easy to say, I just want a couple more trees, really. And then you just increase the number and you have a couple more trees. But what it stops you from doing is you don't have to place every tree manually anymore. You don't have to worry about keeping the density on your brush consistent as you paint a forest across the landscape. Like, everyone that's worked with foliage in Unreal probably knows the frustration of, I have a density set on my foliage brush, and I did one paint stroke, and now I'm doing the next one next to it, but it's counting the instances that I've already placed towards the density. So the second brush stroke has a lower density of trees being placed than the first one, because the total amount of instances in the brush counts to that density. And that's just super painful, and that sort of manual authoring workflow will always have those frustration points. Whereas if you do guided proceduralism like this, you still keep all the control, almost all the control that you would want as an artist, but you skip a lot of the headaches. The one bit of control that we don't currently have a way for is, I want to use the foliage system to put this specific tree in this specific location. If you want to do that right now, you just have to place a tree manually. You have to bypass the foliage system. Realistically, the amount of trees that you should be needing to place manually if you use our tools should be pretty darn minimal, because our tools do a really good job of creating nice foliage distributions and stuff. I haven't ran into situations where I felt the need to create manual foliage since I've started using the cluster system. But if you do, you're in a bit of a rough patch with the plugin solutions, and you'll just need to manually place static meshes or instances, which sucks, but you'll probably live. So that's foliage, which is neat. So now we'll go into a separate level. And actually, we're just going to go into... No, we're not going to go into a different project, because then I don't have nice looking assets to work with. Okay. Let's go into a new folder in here. Can you tell that this project is too big? I have too much stuff. Inside Unreal. Inside Unreal. Save. Yes, thank you. Let's take the post-process volume and ultra-dynamic sky. And that should be good. And then open that level. Check out.
Do I have your permission to use that as our new theme?
What?
The little jingle you just did, singing Inside Unreal.
Oh, yeah. So music is something that happens subconsciously for me. I'm just always in a musical headspace. So I just kind of do music stuff without thinking about it. That also extends to, I will whistle without thinking about it, which always makes the people that I'm calling with very, very happy, as you can imagine, because they'll be like, can you stop whistling? And I'm like, oh yeah, sorry, I'll stop. And then 2 seconds later, I just start whistling again, which is great.
Perfect.
So.
Gotta keep them on their toes.
Okay. Lots of inside Unreal stuff. Oh. Try not to fix it. Okay.
You can also drag and drop the graph if you want.
Yes, you can do that. You can drag and drop the graph, but I couldn't be bothered. When really it would have been less work. So we start with an empty graph. This is very exciting. We place an onConstruct node. That is the entry point for the graph. I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. There's actual documentation on the proper explanations on what all of this does. I'm not going to go through it here because it's too much. It's actually pretty complicated. We have an onConstruct, then we want to spawn a chunk, which we want to do by screen size, because otherwise we don't have LODs, which is kind of a problem when you do a world like this. Then we want to create a mesh component, and then we want to create a mesh from that. There's another cheeky option there, create lightweight mesh, which is new and I haven't tested yet, but I'm worried it'll crash, so I'm not going to use that right now.
Yeah, don't do that.
So we have a generate surface, and then we have the magical density bin. So now we are where we need to be. Let's set a material on this. Good. And now I will need to set up detail textures, because otherwise this is going to be very unhappy. Because this material expects detail texture, so if it doesn't have it, it's just going to cry and be black and stuff. And I probably need context data. Okay, so we're going to ignore all of this for now. Like, none of this is actually relevant. It just needs to exist for the graph to work. So we're going to start. So the magic trick is the density. The density is what your terrain actually looks like. There's some really good resources on there on the interwebs. Oh, my light died. That's sad. Well, you'll have to endure me in darkness. That light was supposed to last 3 hours. Oh well. Now I completely lost my train of thought. That's sad. Density.
There is on the internet with density.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff talking about how marching cubes, which is the algorithm we use to. So, assuming that, we're going to make a density from height, because height is not the same kind of data as density. So we do a conversion for that. This is just some basic math, but it's made easier to not screw it up by using that node. I'm just going to leave that on 0. And what that'll do is it'll create a flat terrain with a height of 0. So if we go down here now, and it's sad and black. Let me fix that. See, this is always sad about not remembering how your stuff works. Okay, good. So now we have a happy colored world. That's better. So we have a flat world. Flat worlds are kind of boring. So instead of doing a flat world, we're going to put an advanced noise node. We need to hook position into that. We're going to do that with position 2D, because we're going to put a query 2D in there so that it knows that it's a height field, so it's like 32 times as fast to compute. And now you see that we have some nice noise going on in the world. And I'm going to get rid of the fog for a second, just to show stuff a bit more. So yeah, nice looking stuff. That's good. Let's keep that. I should note, I'm going to put down a cube. Just so that we all have a little bit of frame of reference on how big all of this is. Because it's not small already. Because this cube now is, let's say, a fairly broad-chested and fat human being. And that compares pretty significantly to what we already have going on in terms of the terrain. I want to note, we have holes between the levels of details in the terrain. That's something that we'll be fixing. That's not here to stay. You won't have to ship your game with holes in the terrain. It's just something that we keep fixing, and then we keep making changes to the meshing system, and then we need to fix it again. So it's just kind of a cascading thing where we have to keep going back around to fix it, and it's a pain in the ass and takes a lot of time. So we've kind of been ignoring that for a bit. But it'll go away, I assure you. So this is a very nice cubey looking human. And it's a pretty big world, and it generates very fast. With that cubey human there, let's go back into the graph. And let's say, this is nice, we have a noisy terrain, but what if I want to put like a cliff down somewhere? We're going to need landmass. So, we have a bunch of magical landmass nodes. Find landmass brushes. What does that do? No idea, but it places the thing and it outputs brushes. Let's drag out from that. What options do we have? Sample landmass brushes. Guess that's a thing. And that takes a 3D position, so I guess that's not query 2D, which makes sense because it's volumetric data that you're working with now instead of just a height field. So you need 3D position, and then we have the max distance and the smoothness. Max distance is an option that shouldn't really need to exist. It does anyway, don't worry about it. But really you want it to be the same as your smoothness, which is, if you remember from our previous demo, how blobby is the terrain? How much does it like smooth together? How much does it smush? So we're going to create a local variable, and we're going to call that smoosh. We're going to plug that into max distance and smoothness, and we're going to put that on 5,000, which is quite a lot, so let's not do 5,000, let's do 500. Because 5,000 is 50 meters, and that will absolutely drown our silly little cubic human. So we have that. Now we have a distance, and we have another distance. How are we going to put those together? Well, there are some nice math tricks for that, which are hidden in a smooth union node so that you don't have to break your head over it. So we do that, and we have another smoothness input. And that other smoothness input, we're just going to plug the same thing into it. But it's actually a really interesting distinction, which I'm not going to plug that into that. We're going to leave that one at 100, and then we'll talk a little bit, once I have a landmass brush in here, about how exactly that works and why that distinction is important. I'm also actually going to fiddle with my webcam for just a second, so that hopefully I'll be a little bit less grim looking. So bear with me for a moment. This is going to make my stream black for just a second. Because I don't know how to access this menu without using OBS, which is kind of sad, but yeah.
Much better.
Scene, inside Unreal, and we should be back. Yeah, stream's live. Cool. So now that you can actually see my facial expressions and stuff again, I feel a little bit more comfortable making jokes. So we have this, and we're going to place a landmass brush. So let's just find a nice mesh somewhere. Assets, nature, rocks, filter by static mesh. Let's start with that one. Are we in landmass mode? Yes, we are. Okay, here it is. That place too. That's interesting. Oh, that removed the terrain because I had the wrong thing selected. Lovely. Oh, yeah, this is... So I think this is because I don't actually have collision on the terrain right now, so I can't select anything. Let me just add collision to the terrain. Which is really straightforward, because I just do create collision component. And then I need to do that. We're going to ignore that for a second. That's just stupid backend stuff. Create no, not block surface. Create collider from matching cube surface. Otherwise, we would be doing Minecraft colliders on a not Minecraft terrain, which is weird. And then it takes a surface input, which we have already got for the mesh. So now, in theory, our selections still don't work. Phi, put on your to-do list, fix brush selection. Thank you.
It should work, it should work.
Well, it doesn't. I don't know what to tell you other than that it doesn't. So anyway, we have this lovely little thing here. I'm actually going to go ahead and in here increase the terrain resolution a little bit, because you might be able to see that this looks kind of sad and facety. It really doesn't need to. So if we just do this, you'll also notice the material is stretching. That's because this material is not set to be triplanar, so it's like doing a top-down projection, which means the sides get stretchy. Don't worry about it, it'll be fine. But it's worth keeping in mind. Anyway, actually, I think I know why that is. Yeah, it's because I'm a big egg. So the reason that is because we have a density, but we're not actually computing the surface normal. So for those that don't know, in rendering, the surface normal is the direction that the surface faces, which the engine uses to say this pixel is lit by the directional light or not. So when we don't set the normal, the engine doesn't know what direction the surface is facing. So in this case, it's probably just assuming that it's pointing straight upwards, which gets tricky when you do things like triplanar projection, because then you need the normal in order to know which way to use the texture. So it's a bit of a circular thing. Anyway, if once we fix the normals, they should actually all be good. So what we're going to do is gradient, and I can't do that because I need to do this to float. This is always really lovely. I have a macro for these nodes now. So you just place a single one, but I don't have that yet in this project, so I still have to do it manually, which is very sad. Okay, so now we have a normal vector. This is how you get the normals on your terrain, by the way, if anyone was wondering. That was already playing with the plugin. And now you see that we do actually have a nice side texture that isn't stretched. And we have rocks, that's nice. Let's make this a little bit less janktastic, because we'll have to put other stuff in this graph still. So it's nicer if it's not headache inducing to that extent. Okay, so we have this, and we have a landmass brush. And we can see that nicely move around and blend in with the terrain and stuff. It's quite big already compared to a human being, so let's not make it any bigger. You'll see that blending with the terrain. Let's try and make that blend a little bigger. And that blend, I'm getting bigger. Reason for that, I'll get to in a second. Once I change this smoothness, let's not set it to 5,000 for reasons we alluded to before, set that to 500, it gets bigger. The reason for that is because this smoothness is the smoothness used for blending the brushes with the rest of the terrain. This smoothness is the smoothness used for blending brushes with each other. So if we take a brush and we place another one, now you'll see there's a big ball because it's trying to blend this brush with the other brush right next to it, which creates this big ball of goop. So if you just reduce their smoothness to 0, for instance, you'll find they just sit there separate from each other, which is good, but a little bit sad. So let's make them hug a little bit. Set it to 200, they merge together a little bit. So how this works, well, what this lets you do is by splitting things into separate landmass layers, which have different smoothnesses relative to each other, you can have bits of terrain which are super smooth into each other, but not into the rest of the terrain. So for instance, you can have cliff meshes, which have relatively sharp transitions into the rest of your terrain, but very smooth transitions into other cliff meshes, so that your cliffs are a nice contiguous mesh, but they do have a relatively sharp transition where they meet the landscape underneath. And then, you get into subtractive brushes, which we'll get into in just a second, and you also, again, have loads of options with how you use that smoothness to make them look nice with their surroundings. So for starters, let's rotate this so it's not exactly the same, turn it around, maybe do that. It's weird. Merp. Cool, fun stuff. Now we have an arch. Did I mention, because I find this a fun feature, because this isn't possible with a lot of distance field related stuff in Unreal Engine, you can negatively scale these, and they work just fine. I just want to mention that, because it might be something that a lot of people are like, yeah, it's annoying because with distance fields you can never flip stuff. You can. We account for that. You don't have to worry about it. It just works. So you can negatively scale stuff, which means you don't have to have like a left turn mesh and a right turn mesh. You can just have a left turn mesh and then flip it when you need it to be a right turn mesh, and it works. So we have this, which is neat. Now we kind of don't need a subtractive brush because we already have a hole. So let's put down a different brush so that we do need a hole. Let's do Canyon Rock Long 7. Very long because it's capitalized, you can tell. Yeah, that's fairly long, I guess. Let's scale that up a little bit. And yeah, that's probably a pretty impenetrable barrier to our cubic human. So how's a cubic human going to get around this? Select them and put them over there. Just, roleplay value. We do need to feel invested in our world creation. I always feel that it helps to be invested in what you're creating by just trying to move yourself into it. Yeah, sure, check it out. So we have this impenetrable barrier. We want to get a hole in that so that our human can move to the other side. So to the graph we go. We have a smooth union here, which is great. We're actually going to duplicate this, by the way, because we'll need another one, because we have main, which is our positive layer, but we don't want to use those same brushes to also subtract, because then we won't have the additive layer anymore. So these guys need to be on a separate layer. So we're going to call this very originally main subtractive. Very hard word to spell. Main subtractive. I'm going to copy that so I don't have to spell it and miswrite it again when I get to actually making a brush that needs it. So we have this. So how do we make that subtract? There is one sad trick that I need to do here due to some silly little thing in the lower level bowels of the plugin. Thank you, Fi. Please, at some point we need to account for this. Thanks. So ignore these 3 nodes. We need smooth subtraction. What a miracle, who'd have guessed? Smooth subtraction lets you subtract one thing from another thing. So we put a smooth subtraction in there, and we put those together. And now nothing, because we didn't actually place a mesh yet. So let's grab one of these and smoosh it in there. That's all good. And Ctrl-Shift-S, because sometimes the plugin crashes. That happens with beta products. And now it's made subtractive, and nothing happens. It's kind of sad. I don't know why that is, actually. Did I not
You
hook
need to
things up
invert the
correctly?
2 pins on the
Oh, of
you want to
course.
select like the other one.
Yeah, so that's always fun with subtractive. You actually need to worry about pin order, which makes things confusing. That still looks like it's not actually doing its job. No, that definitely shouldn't be it anyway. This is sad. This is very underwhelming.
Do you want to just link that subtractive layer to like the output so we can see if the brush is actually writing to that?
I mean, what I can do is this. Oh, I can't. Do landmass brushes not work with preview?
They should, but let's assume not.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, so what do you want me to do?
So if you just like use the graph at the top as the main output and bypass the subtractive entirely.
Hold on. Graph froze. It's not updating. That's what this is. Because right now, this isn't connected. This should not be contributing. These landmass brushes should not affect anything, but they are. So I'm just going to go ahead and reload this level. And did I mention that we're in beta and sometimes there's some issues?
It's the nature of live.
Okay, well, this still doesn't work, so let's actually restart the entire engine. We'll get there eventually, I'm sure. So, how's everyone's day going?
Fantastic. How about your day? Going good? Scale of 1 to 10?
Probably a solid 7.5. Too much water.
7.5's not bad. I'll take 7.5.
Then again, considering that just having too much water took 2.5 points of it, you start to wonder. Multiple local variable declarations not supported. Oh! So, here's a wise lesson. Never collapse your error logs so much that you don't see the errors anymore. That is a bad thing to do. Because as a matter of fact, once there are errors, your graph will not update its compilation state anymore, because it'll error out. So, this makes a lot of sense. The reason for this is because local variables can only have one number assigned to them, because it's a local variable. So, I need to do that instead. Or that. You can have multiple getters, but I had multiple setters, so then it doesn't work. So that restart was completely in vain, but at least we found the issue. So now, in theory, if we load the right map, we will be able to save a sad human being who was completely stuck on the wrong side of this cliff. And you can already see a little divot. So let's go cut a big divot. That's probably not quite big enough. You can see the other side. Move it down so it's at the right height. And now we want to rotate it a little bit so that it's like in line with the slope of the terrain underneath. And now we have this. A little passageway for a human to go through. Oh. So silliness aside, we have some little jaggies there. And the reason for that is because we have smoothness here, which is set to the same as those other brushes, but this is the smoothness between the subtractive brushes. So that's not doing anything. we have this smoothness, which is how smooth the subtraction on the main terrain actually is, which in this case is not that smooth. 1 meter isn't really that much. So let's make that 5 meters. And now we have a really smooth, curvy cave. That's a nice cave. So this is a lovely home for a human. And now I'm going to try using something that I haven't used in literal months, and it may or may not crash the engine.
Risky plays.
Yep. The things I do for love. Damn it. I need to bookmark this folder. It would really be good. I need it so often. Let's see, what mesh shall we use? I have too many meshes. And none of them... How is it that I have literal hundreds of meshes and none of them serve my purpose? Okay.
I feel like that's just everything all the time.
Okay, so here's a magical thing. It works. It did not crash the engine. If I was sitting here nervously hoping it wouldn't die.
It just works.
Yeah. So that just worked. I'm quite excited about that. So I right now have this as a positive brush, but actually I want to use this as a negative brush because this is actually something really interesting and something that was super hard to do in 1.2, but super easy to do now. So drawing spline caves, anyone? And, you know, right now we don't have that high of a smoosh in here, so let's set that to 1500 instead. And now we get a really nice tunnel. And, yeah, you know, let's make that come back up. And then we can decide, actually, I want to move the entire thing a little bit. Let's have that cave over there instead. Now we have a cave over there instead. Oh, it's a little bit too high. Now we have the surface poking through. Let's move it lower. Lower. Let's move it down until this is barely an entrance. It's worth noting that cave is like pretty light down here. We don't currently support Lumen. It's coming. We will support Lumen. Nanite's a different story. Nanite is very much made for like offline pre-computed stuff, so Nanite support is unfortunately not something we can do. It's not our fault, sorry. We did try. We did actually make it work. It was just unfortunate that it would take like 30 seconds per chunk to build the nanite mesh, and you'd only be able to do it in editor. So if you ever wanted to actually ship your game, tough luck. But in theory, it worked. So there's that. But yeah, this sort of works, and it's really neat. We have grass on the bottom because of how I have my material set up, but you know, grassy bottoms are neat. So that's most of the stuff I wanted to cover on landmass. Now, there's one sad thing with foliage right now, because I'm about to add foliage to this, but I just want to preempt it with foliage only works on height maps right now. We are actively working on making it work with the volumetric stuff as well, because that's kind of important for a Voxel plugin. But it'll get there. Right now it doesn't. So what you'll find is where we cut holes like this, the trees will just float on top of the hole. And where we put walls down like this, the trees will just kind of sit inside of the mountain. It happens. We'll have to deal. Oh, anyway, we go into the graph. I shouldn't use my second screen because then you guys can't see. Let's place a second on construct. So at any given time, every single on construct node in your graph will run whenever the world starts. So you can have as many as you want, so you don't have to like, you know, do foliage and have a node over here with a wire connected to over here. You can just place multiple on constructs and you're done. So we're going to put an on construct. Let's just for posterity put it over here. And then we do a spawn chunks for foliage because again, we don't support volumetric stuff right now. You want to do spawn chunks 2D. This doesn't have LODs, but that's desirable for foliage because you don't want the resolution you're operating on, or like the scale you're operating on, to randomly change as you get further away from the camera. Then you would like get fewer trees at a distance, which is weird. I'm actually not even sure if that would be the case anymore. But anyway, don't think about it too much. Just use a chunk 2D spawner. See, this is fun when you have emergent graph systems like this. In 1.2, we would have had to like hard code how the foliage system works, so we would just hard code it to work with a 2D spawner. But now, theoretically, you can just plug a 3D spawner into it, or a screen size spawner into it, and it'll do something. I'm just not quite sure what it'll do because it wasn't necessarily designed to do that. We can try that sometime, though. Maybe we can try it live risky. So, foliage. Create foliage mesh component. And then we take a chunk data pin. Foliage. Generate instance. And then it complains that the instance template is null, which makes sense. So the instance templates are what we looked at before, which are comparable to the landscape foliage types. So if we look in here, this is just a grass mesh and a grass mesh. Each of them has a weight. We have some rendering settings. We have scale. We have alignment to the surface. That's about it. There's nothing especially interesting in there. The only maybe worth mentioning things are distance between points, which is the density. So like each grass unit will have 50 centimeters between it and the next one, roughly. And these are slope restrictions. So like this grass will only spawn up to 32 degrees slope. Anything above that, it won't spawn. So that's defined in here as well. So some of the procedural rules, basically anything that impacts the behavior of your foliage, the visual style of your foliage, lives in the foliage assets. So we have this. This takes a mask pin, which is a multiplier for the density. So if I set this to 0.5, I will get more or less 100 centimeters of distance between each grass instance instead of 50 centimeters. Not useful in this case, but useful to know. This one you never ever need to think about unless you do very strange stuff with your graph. And this one is a multiplier for the rendering distance on the foliage. So that can be useful to have in your graph if you have like quality settings or need to initialize stuff differently for different biomes. Can be useful, not super common, but it's there. So the main one here is height. And our height is over here. So what we're going to do is we're going to promote this to a local variable and call that height. Very original. And then we're going to grant that height, which is, by the way, the same Ctrl drag, Alt drag hotkeys that you have in Blueprint for getters and setters. And then we put that in there. And now, in theory, ta-da! We have grass. And this grass doesn't spawn on the cliffs, as you can see. And it also doesn't spawn on this surface. Instead, it spawns inside this surface, which is unfortunate, but hey. Also, guess where the cave is? Ha ha ha. But details. So it has some caveats, but you get the idea. The grass works. So that's the basic instance templates. And then there's the really cool stuff, which is the foliage. It's worth noting when you're actually like in production making something, you probably want to fiddle with like the render distance in chunks, because right now this, for instance, has a render distance of 500 to 10,000 times 2, because I have a multiplier over there, so 20,000 units. So ideally, I don't want to generate them much farther away than 20,000 units. So in this case, 5 times 32,000 is not enough, actually. Theoretically, I should be seeing a cutoff point somewhere where they disappear. And you can actually see that if you look very carefully, but it probably won't come through on the stream compression. Anyway, that's fine. So don't worry about that too much, but it's a thing to keep in mind when you're actually using the plugin. You don't want to have your distances be humongous if you don't need it, because it will actually generate all those instances, which is expensive if you don't use them anyway. So we'll just do another spawn chunks by range, and we'll plug that one in there. So this pin is essentially start doing this, and then while you're doing this, also start doing this. And then when you say start doing this, for each chunk that you're spawning, do this. So the 2 execution pins do different things. In this case, you want to use the top one. So then we have another on chunk spawned. For this one, we'll probably want to increase the distance a little bit. So let's just 16,000. And then we do a class create foliage mesh component. No, not create mesh component. Create foliage mesh component. There we go. And then class setup. There we go. And again, it's going to complain. And again, we're going to need the height thing. That's all fine and dandy. We don't really have anything else in here other than some technical stuff. Don't worry about it. Yeah, so then we have this. So let's do some birch trees. And now we have birch trees being generated kind of everywhere. And you'll see that they pop in as we go because we don't have a render distance set to that far. You can see every individual little chunk popping in. Realistically, these chunks could be bigger for this sort of foliage. So let's say 64,000. Can you tell where the trees end? Because I can't. This is always neat. This is just interesting to think about because you get to the point where, you know, without any real issue, you can render stuff far enough, at least on the generation side. Like rendering performance is always just going to be an issue, but that's more of an asset issue than a framework issue realistically at this point. We get to the point where you can render enough trees, generate enough trees in the system that it's just kind of a non-issue relative to your view distance in most cases. So that's an interesting thing to consider. It means that you don't like get so hard constrained so much by whether you can have things from an artistic perspective, which is always a good constraint to get rid of. So yeah, now we have trees. And I should caveat this with the fact that obviously I spent a lot of time configuring these assets and I know this system pretty well. But if you consider that we have been looking at this graph for probably like 45 minutes and we got this result, and realistically we did a bunch of explanation and nothing especially complex, and the result looks like this. The plugin has become super powerful and it's really easy to produce incredibly diverse and interesting looking stuff. You know, if we go back to our brushes and stuff here, it's really easy to imagine, say you have a little ritual site. So you have, you know, some sort of megalithic rock structure that just kind of sits here like this. And then in the middle here, you have a little altar. So you want to get rid of the trees. Let's do that. So remember that mask thing we talked about that we're not currently using? We can use that. Because landmass brushes, as we briefly discussed at some point, I think, we might not have actually, this is a distance field. This data can do whatever you want it to do. So in this case, this data is saying negative sign is inside, positive sign is outside, so 0 is a mesh. But when you have -1, 0, 1, and a gradient that goes like that, you can also use that gradient to do other things. So you can say, the inside of this mesh, I don't want foliage to generate in, or I only want it to generate inside. So let's grab this and take it over here. Now we want to convert this to a float because this takes a float rather than a density. Effectively, a density is a float. It's just a special float that we want you to not accidentally use a float for. So like we don't want you to plug a float into a density pin here. So it's a separate type because it's really easy to make mistakes with if you don't understand which thing is a density field and which thing is just a random float value. Because from a data standpoint, they're the same, but from a usage standpoint, they're really different. So that's why you have that distinction, but in essence, they're the same thing and you can just cast back and forth between the two. So we're going to turn this distance field into a float. And let's plug this into color first, actually. So we're going to call that foliage. And we're going to do a make. and hopefully that doesn't crash. I need to 1 minus x that, because I want inside to be red. And then I'm going to get rid of the foliage for just a second so that we can see this more easily. So we have this, and now let's grab one of these things. And instead of having it contribute to the mesh, let's have it contribute to foliage. So you can see that the inside is now red. Now I already had this material set up to use vertex colors, so what I'm doing right now is I'm writing this into the vertex color and then sampling that in the material, so it's a little bit more work to make this actually happen than I'm showing, but only like 10 clicks more realistically. But what we can do now is we can show how you can manipulate these distance fields, because you'll see this is a hard edge right now. But that doesn't need to be a hard edge, because a distance field isn't just inside or outside, it's a gradient. So 50 centimeters inside, that value will be approximately minus 50. 200 centimeters outside, that value will be approximately 200. So if you want, say, 100 centimeters of fall off, or let's do a little bit more, 200 centimeters of fall off, you divide this by 200, and suddenly this is 0, and this, 2 meters in, instead of being minus 200, you divide it by 200, is minus 1. So let's do that in the graph, and you'll immediately see that this is just actually an incredibly powerful data source once you wrap your head around how to do the math with it. So we've divided by 200, and now we have a smooth transition. We make that 500 instead. You'll see that fall off gets more gradual, but it's a distance. So we can't only divide, we can also offset it, because right now the transition point is over here. But if we have minus 500 and we add, let's say subtract, we subtract 500, minus 500 is now minus 1,000, 0 is now minus 500, 500 is now 0. So when we subtract 500, our surface moves 5 meters out. So let's do that. So we've got this. We put a subtract node in here. We start with 0. And this is a little bit counterintuitive again, because negative is inside. So in order to make it bigger, you need to subtract. So if we subtract 500, hit enter, I screwed up. Did the math the wrong way around in my head. Anyway, despite the explanation. Let's ignore the number for a second. Oh, yeah, right. Yep, that's the one. Thank you. So, yeah. I was actually considering saying right before I did this, because I initially was going to put this subtract node after the divide. But after the divide, this is a very different number, and I shouldn't subtract minus 500 anymore, because this is now like effectively multiplied by 500. So if I were to minus 500, I'd be offsetting by 500 times 500 instead. So you got to be careful with this math, but if you're careful with it, you can do a lot with it. So we're going to do this. Actually, I shouldn't be doing it like this. This is all very wonky and wrong, and don't do this. I'm doing lots of illegal math things right now. Don't let me be your teacher in this. Okay, this is more healthy, reasonable math. This is more what you should aspire to. Because don't 1 minus x things that aren't clamped becomes very weird. So let's set this to 0 again. So you'll see it is this size right now. Now we subtract 500, and it's gotten bigger. 1,000, it's gotten even bigger. Make that fall off bigger. And we get just this really big blob. Again, remember, this brush is the same as this brush, data-wise. Like, that shape is now this red fall-off blob. So we can do the same with the foliage. So now that we've used the color to visualize this, we're going to grab it. We're going to disconnect it so that we have a nice colorful terrain again. And then we're going to move this down to our foliage. let's plug the foliage in first so you can actually see the change unfold. So we have this. I'm not actually sure if this is going to work because we're now doing a 3D query. I guess it should work. So we do a mask. And we only have foliage in there. And if you get rid of this 1 minus x, we only have foliage outside of there. And again, we can push this around. We can make it smaller. We can make it bigger. We can make it a hard edge or a very smooth edge. That's not a very smooth edge, what the heck? Anyway, you can make it a very smooth edge in theory. Yeah, no, you can see actually it is a smooth edge. It's just when you work with random numbers, math sometimes doesn't work in your favor. So because we don't have that many instances here, the maths are not in my favor, and we end up with like the 5 clusters that would be over here just coincidentally having low numbers and being called out. So on this side, you can see that we have a smooth transition from no foliage to having some foliage. And on this side, we just got unlucky with the random numbers game, and we have a fairly abrupt transition. That is a downside of working with random numbers, kind of inevitable. That said, it's a pretty good approximation. If we do this, you can see, once as the position changes, the numbers change. So now we do have a couple more of them on the inside. We can continue to change these numbers. And now you can really see that we have this gradual addition back in. So like this is full forest, this is empty, and in between here we have a couple of clusters. So this bit just actually becomes an incredibly powerful tool for quickly authoring really dynamic world results. And for me, it's been incredibly fun to explore world creation this way, because when you're creating a world, you have an idea and you go, let's see if I can do this and whether that result would work. And you're always trying to get that iteration time from cool idea to actually trying it as small as possible. And with traditional workflows, that iteration time, you want to get rid of a bunch of trees somewhere and like quickly switch back and forth between having them or not. That is a complex operation that you have to do all the time. That takes minutes every time you need to switch it. Whereas like this, it takes just like switching a value in the graph, and then it regenerates in 2 seconds. So the transition time to go from an idea to actually trying things is orders of magnitude shorter, which means you just get to spend more time actually having fun instead of fighting the system or waiting for things to process. So that is super cool, and I find that incredibly exciting. I'm going to look at my notes now to see if I've missed anything that I wanted to talk about. There are a couple of just generic notes. The first one is that this stuff cannot, almost all of this stuff can run on the GPU. So if I wanted to, I could say, sorry, that's run on CPU, not run on GPU. I could say this. And now the mesh generation is being done on the GPU. Or sorry, not the mesh generation, technically, the distance field generation. You might have noticed that that was not faster. You would not be incorrect, which is why we don't usually run that on the GPU. Because when you do compute stuff on the GPU and then need to push it back to the CPU, you have the CPU saying, hey, I need this data, GPU compute it for me. Then you wait for the GPU to compute it for you, and then it gets sent back to the CPU. So the GPU compute part is super fast, way faster than the CPU compute part. That might be 0.1 second. Numbers are hypothetical and rubbish, but just keep, for the illustration. 0.1 second on the GPU versus 1 second on the CPU. But in order to get the GPU to do that, you first have to issue the command, wait for it to register it. That might take half a second. And then you need the GPU to go, I've done it, here's the data back, which takes another second. So now you have 0.5 seconds waiting for the GPU to start, 0.1 second doing it, and then another second and a half for the GPU sending the data back. So you end up with 3 seconds for an operation that would have taken 1 second to just do on the CPU in the first place. So the GPU does the compute faster, but because you're sending data back and forth, it is still slower in the end. So we do detail texture calculation on the GPU because the detail textures don't ever need to go back to the CPU. They can stay on the graphics cards. That's the only place they need. So you don't need to communicate back and forth. Makes it so much faster. So then the GPU is just a really good choice. But when you need to upload back to the CPU, it's not as clear cut anymore, and you're consuming bandwidth that needs to be used for other things. So it's not usually a very good idea, unless you have profiled and for a fact statistically that it's a better idea. But it's not something you should do for the sake of it sounding like it should be faster, because it probably isn't. But it can run on the GPU, which is super cool.
I'm baiting.
Then what we have beyond that, we talked a little bit about Lumen support. That's coming. We have canvases, which are the manual edit volumes. We already have the height one. So earlier when I was painting mountains, I was using a height canvas. And that is just, you use tools to draw into a map, and then it works. Sorry. What was I saying? Canvas. Haha. So canvases work. They need a bunch more work. They're going to get reworked. They're going to get better. They don't support volumetric stuff yet. Right now, they're only height and weight, which is not that perfect. We'll get there. Beyond that, we have... so this is the part where my presentation falls apart a little bit in terms of how smoothly it goes, because now I just need to actually check a list and make sure I've ticked all the boxes. So we have GPU, we have canvases, we have height maps covered. We don't have height maps covered. Landmass brushes, so far, we have been showing the volumetric ones. We also have them in height variants, which are faster and less memory intensive. So let's plop one of those down. If I even have a height map asset in this project. That is not how you spell height. And landmass height brushes. So this is a separate data stack. So we have a landmass brush layer called main. That is not the same as our landmass height map brush layer called main. That's a different layer. So we sample that, and you'll see this takes a base height and a height as output. So we put that here. It goes yoink. Let's do that. So we have this, this, position to D, and then we need to actually place a height map brush. That is helpful for when demonstrating this sort of thing. Yes, doggy, you shake yourself. That is not a height map. Voxel. Sorry, what? Voxel height map. There we go. Okay, yeah, this is riveting. This is my height map. I know this is not the most exciting height map demonstration. This is what I use in that other map where I have the mountains. I use height map brushes as weight maps. So these brushes define where the mountains are on that map. So that's why I only have a sphere height map brush. It's very exciting, I know. Anyway, you can see it works, and the foliage updates along with it, and you can like move it around in the height, and you can increase the smoothness because that still works with the height map brushes and stuff. And what's interesting about this, and I can't really demonstrate it properly because I only have the sphere brush, but you can rotate these to some extent. So you can rotate them. Imagine you have a mountain like this, and you turn it, turn it, turn it, turn it, turn it, until this point of turning, it's still a height map. At this point of turning, you now, like if you cast a ray downwards, you hit this point, and then there's empty space again after that hit. So at this point of turning, it can't be represented by height anymore. So once you rotate it past that point, this just becomes filled, and it won't look right anymore. But you can rotate until that point without any issues. And if you're okay with that artifact, you can continue turning, although it's a bit weird. Probably don't want to do that, but you can. So you can have a mountain mesh and just like tilt it a little bit so that it works a little bit better for your use case. You're not limited to having it exactly represented as a straight mesh the way that you often are when you're working with height map tooling. So even when you're working with height fields in the plugin, you're generally still more flexible in the tooling you have available to you than you would be if you just used a pure height field solution. Because the fact that we do already do lots of 3D computation makes it a lot easier for us to cover the edge case of your height information doing some 3D transformations. So that's a cool use case. Again, I can't really show it because my height map is a sphere, which is not a very interesting shape to see rotated. But it's possible, just trust me on that one. So beyond that, yeah, there's the exciting thing that aside from the GPU thing, because like the GPU thing is neat, but honestly not that useful in most cases. There's like specific cases where it's really useful, and we hope to make it more useful as we go into the future, but it's not right now. But what is super cool is the fact that you can do this. I forgot the name for a second because it's in a category in my head, but that's not the category it actually lives in. This node is a magic node that lets you run the graph on your game thread. Well, no, that's not right. You can't run the graph on your game thread yet. You can evaluate, query the graph from your game thread. So in your gameplay logic, you can say, I want to know what the graph outputs as this data at this exact location. Now, in this case, we're just querying the height. So realistically, you could also just like trace array down and you'd probably be fine. But what you can also do is expose your material weights, for instance. So you can query all your material weights on your game thread at runtime, and it'll just work. This is queryable from Blueprint and C++, at least C++ right now, and it should be queryable from Blueprint soon. There's like a couple of annoying things we need to do, so we haven't gotten around to it yet, but we will very soon. We've done it before, it's just not there right now. But what's interesting about this is that you're not limited to things like floats. If you particularly want to, and I hope this works, I think it used to work at the very least. Yes. You can expose any struct. So you can query a mesh that's being generated as a whole, just the actual mesh data. And that means that you now have like the tri-mesh data that you can just like do stuff on. And obviously you could already do that because you could get it from the procedural mesh component. But you can also get the marching cube data that we use internally. I don't know why you would want to do that, but you could. And the fun thing with options like these is they are not useful in a lot of cases. I mean, the querying on the whole is super useful, being able to use it on the game thread. But the advanced stuff, like being able to query a mesh, is generally not super useful. But then sometimes people come up with super clever advanced workflows where they make use of some weird trick to achieve a cool effect that they couldn't have done without being able to access data like this. And then it is super cool to just be able to throw any data onto the game thread for our users to be able to do literally anything they want with it. So it's less about the fact that you can query your mesh so much as it is about the fact that you can query literally anything and it'll just work, and you can do whatever you want with it because of that. So I don't know yet what you're going to do with it, but I'm sure that they'll do something really cool with it at some point. So that's that. Again, main use case realistically for it is like material weights. Is there sand? Is there grass? What footstep sound do I play? Something that you traditionally often use like physical materials for and stuff, but you can also just like query it from the graph directly. So that's like the less exciting but very practical use case. But it's very good to have that around so that you can just actually do stuff with the voxel data from a gameplay perspective, and you can potentially store actual gameplay information in the voxel data structure, use that in your generator to like do some visual stuff, and then also pass that back for gameplay purposes and edit that data through Canvas afterwards. So it opens lots of doors for a back and forth clear communication path between gameplay and the graph. In both directions instead of only in one direction, the way we've had it in the past and the way it worked in most systems. So, with that, I believe I have covered pretty much all the stuff I wanted to talk about. I'm having a quick look if there's anything I missed. But I don't think they are.
Fantastic.
So, thanks for coming for my TED Talk.
Yeah, that was absolutely incredible. There were several times throughout that demo that not only myself, but I was watching chat and we were all freaking out. Just what? That was incredible. And then you turn around and do another incredible thing right after. And then we haven't had time to even absorb the first incredible thing. And it's just, we're overwhelmed with the possibilities.
Yeah, I'm a little bit sad that like I've been talking for 2 hours and I still feel like I could keep going and like I haven't had enough time to actually explain all the stuff I've been doing. But yeah, hey, it happens.
It's a good thing. Yeah, that just means that there's truly endless possibilities with this incredible plugin that y'all have made. It's truly just mind-blowing. And especially a lot of these updates that you've talked about being available in 2.0 coming out soon it went from already being insane to just unfathomable. It's really genuinely impressive, the things that y'all have done so far.
Very much appreciate that. I do want to address for a second, because you referred to 1.2, and obviously I've referred to 1.2 over the stream. And this is like slightly less cheery than everything else I've been talking about. I want to apologize to our 1.2 users who have been stuck on a version that they were hoping to get more support for, and that hasn't come. We, at some point, have had to make a decision between supporting 1.2 and sacrificing our release date for 2.0, because 1.2 is in a state where any work that we do on it is just tremendously much more to achieve the same result than that would have been to do in 2.0. So to, say, implement a new feature or fix a feature in 1.2 is generally like an order of magnitude more work than to do that same thing from scratch in 2.0. Which means that if we were to fix a couple of features in 1.2 and still leave half of it in the rough state that it is in right now, in which, by the way, there have actually been proper productions that have released really cool products with it, so kudos to those teams. But if we had decided to fix those things, we would have pushed the 2.0 release date another year, which would only have made the gap between having a really good usable foundation to work off in the future even bigger. So I'm sorry to the teams that are stuck with 1.2 in a way that they're not entirely happy with. Everybody will be getting access to 2.0. All of our existing users will be getting 2.0. We hope that that, to some extent, lessens the hurt and that people can get excited about what's coming down the line. And hopefully this will have set us up for a significantly healthier product pipeline and update workflow in the future, so that we don't have to go through this all again with the community. But we also very much appreciate all the support that we've been getting from all of our users throughout all of this, because we know it's been rough, and thank you all for sticking with us anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's obvious the work that you've put into this, so...
Oh, yeah, it's sometimes we sort of have a reflection moment, and we're like, yeah, we did actually do some funky stuff. Yesterday, Fi and I were looking at, because we're aggressively writing documentation at the moment, and I was talking to Fi about that. I need him to write 2 pages of documentation, one on basic node implementation, so just like making basic custom functionality for the graph, because it's super easily extendable, just basic C++, and you can write your own node. And then on the flip side, there is the super low level stuff that goes into making really high performance nodes that also run on the GPU and that use like simultaneous instruction sets on the CPU rather than just boring old C++. And that is super complex. And Fire's like, yeah, users don't need that. And I'm like, yeah, they don't need to do it, but I do want them to be able to understand how it works. But we were just scrolling through some of that code as we were looking at this. And we're like, this is actually pretty insane because we just have this system that flexibly switches between all of these things, and we just casually dispatch a compute shader and then run it in ISPC if we can't do that because we detect we don't have a GPU, and it just all works and returns the same thing. And yeah, there's a lot going on. 2.0 has been an interesting journey in that a lot of the time there isn't that much interesting visual stuff, but the stuff going on in the hood, under the hood, is just actually nuts. I encourage rendering engineers and like avid C++ people to dive into the source code and have fun because it's just super interesting. I'm not an engineer and I have fun reading the source code sometimes.
Awesome. Yeah. I feel like that's most of development anyway. About 80% of it is absolutely incredible, but there's no visual representation of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's always rough. But hey, shit happens. So, have there been any community questions?
Yes, there's quite a few actually. Although I do have to commend you because a lot of the questions you ended up just answering naturally through going through the tools. So the list is a lot shorter than it was originally, but we do still have a few if y'all are up for answering some of those.
Yeah, all good.
Absolutely. All right, I'll just start from the top and we'll go straight down. So they might be a little all over the place, but it's fine.
That's all good.
And I won't necessarily address these to either one of you in particular. It's just whoever wants to take it, go for it, sort of thing. So
I want to bring up one thing
have...
before we go into this, and it might already be in the questions as well, but in case it's not. Multiplayer in 2.0 is not supported, but something we do want to make as easy as possible. So we don't want to like put on the tin, this is plug and play multiplayer, it just works, because it doesn't. Multiplayer is super complicated, and as we mentioned at the very beginning of the stream, working with a height field is one thing. Working with an interactable height field is already kind of a pain in the ass. But then with voxels, we have 32 times that data on average, if not even more in a lot of cases. So you're talking about so stupidly much data that there isn't a generic solution anymore. So we don't want people to embark on multiplayer with Voxel plugin on the assumption that they'll be able to easily figure it out. The plugin can absolutely do multiplayer, but you need to be comfortable with like not super low level, but pretty complex multiplayer and replication stuff in order to really produce a good result with it. Because voxel data is just super big and complex and has lots of edge cases, so you need to do everything properly. You can't cut corners. So that makes things super complex. So when we say we don't support multiplayer, it's not you can't do multiplayer with the plugin. It's just don't expect it to magically do the job for you. You'll have to put a lot of work in to make a stable multiplayer product that does everything properly. So that's that addressed, and maybe that takes away a couple of questions that people might have.
It did. There were a few about multiplayer. So got ahead of those. Gosh, at this point, I should just let you go and see if you can just answer all of them without even knowing what they are.
I can do bingo with it.
Yeah, exactly. So the first one we have is from Thomas Franklin. And they're wondering, how well does the new Voxel Plugin 2.0 handle high definition, smaller micro voxels, not polygon looking, for example, versus the previous version?
I would say on the whole, it will handle it significantly better. There are a lot of considerations with this. One of them just being like the data perspective, how we just talked about. Like you have a lot of data to work with. Depending on how you store that, how you manage it, it becomes a lot. And obviously, as you go up in resolution, like if you have, and this is already a thing when you're working with height fields and stuff, when you're like talking about a 1024 texture to a 2048 texture, that's like twice the resolution, but 4 times the memory consumption. When you do that in 3D, you go, 1024 to 2048 is not 2 times, 4 times, it is 8 times the memory consumption. So that makes things very tricky, because when you're working with high resolution source assets, even if you're doing something like the landmass workflow, our brushes by default, those cliff brushes, are probably something like, what would it be, 20 by 20 voxels? So like 20 by 10 by 20. If instead you need to do that at like 100 times that resolution, our landmass workflow doesn't work anymore. Because every asset will take so much memory that it just falls apart. So the point of this being, 2.0 is way more flexible than 1.2 ever was for all of this sort of stuff. And you absolutely can already do a lot with the stock things. But depending on the specifics of what you want to do with this, you will want to explore implementing custom nodes and custom like storage system to do specifically what you need it to do for your specific use case. Because when you're working with high resolution stuff, you need a lot of data, and when you need a lot of data, you need specialized solution to like get rid of every tiny bit of data that you don't need for your very specific use case. So it's possible, and it's kind of the same situation as with multiplayer. Be ready to put the work in if you really need that to do specific things and do it really well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like this next question kind of goes hand in hand with what you were just saying, but Salty Mayhem, wonderful name by the way, was wondering, will 2.0 be able to support terrain materials from things like megascans?
So we use a standard material system from Unreal. You won't be able to convert a landscape material to a voxel material in place anymore, because we just don't support that framework anymore. Right now, we don't have any framework for handling large amounts of layers. We have one system planned for handling that, and it's very different from how landscapes approach it. So there isn't an easy conversion between the two. So when it comes to actually making the materials, you will have to either use our example materials or figure out how to do it yourself based on our example materials and stuff. But when it comes to just using textures and that sort of thing, we are still using the Unreal Engine material framework. So like we might build a management layer on top so you can have more layers, but in the end it still uses the materials so you can do whatever you want with it, really. So if you need something specific, you can do something specific. If you just want to import textures and use them on a stock material that we ship with the plugin, then you can take Megascan textures and plug them in there, and it should just do the job.
Awesome. That'll be insane. I'm very excited to see what people can do with combining some of these things.
Tessellation will come
next-
at that, by the way.
Mm.
That kind of goes hand in hand with Megascans, because people are like, oh, can I do like nice displacement on my rock surface and stuff? And yes, at some point you will. Doggy, sure. Yes, you're a good girl. Yes, next question.
Yes, next question. Handela is wondering, what is your vision for voxels in the future? And how small can we get with voxels? And where is the bottleneck currently?
The bottleneck is, and this is a stupid answer, the bottleneck is data throughput. And the bottleneck is always data throughput. Because even, so say we look at our GPU performance. When we're generating a world, our performance isn't bottlenecked by how fast the GPU can compute stuff. It's bottlenecked by how fast the GPU can read information and then write information out again. So like the actual operation of like adding A and B together is stupid fast, but reading A, reading B, and then writing C takes time. And because we're working even at our current scale with like 50 centimeter resolution, you're generally talking about millions of operations per chunk. That's a million like 3 million read and write ops in this example. So you end up really quickly bottlenecked by just the sheer amount of data that needs to be pushed around rather than the actual operations. And as we talked about just now, when you go up in resolution by a factor 2, your data consumption goes up by a factor 8, which means that when you go from 50 centimeters to 25 centimeters, you now use 8 times the memory bandwidth. So that memory bandwidth that already was the bottleneck is now an even bigger bottleneck. And memory bandwidth bottlenecks aren't something where you're like, it'll just like go a little bit slower or it's an exponential drop off or something. It's just at some point, the thing is full and you can't push more through it. So you have something like on a modern GPU, 400 gigabytes per second to push through the memory. So you're absolutely fine. You won't really see many performance drops until you hit that 400 gigabytes per second, and then everything will just crash and burn and things will be really slow from there on out. So you can't increase the data that much. So the moment you start increasing the data you're using, you need to start being clever about how to reduce the data you're using. So if you say, and in the end, that's a lot of the voxel problem solving, when you're saying, one of the first optimizations that people do when they're like doing their own little voxel projects for fun is you start with just, a 3D grid. And it's a single grid and every point stores a value. The first optimization people make is, okay, well, I want my world to be bigger, but I can't keep all that data. So I'm going to instead store chunks. And then for each chunk, I'm going to check if it has data in it. And if it doesn't, I'm only going to store a single bit for that chunk, saying this chunk doesn't have data, instead of storing every point. What that lets you do is, if your chunk is 32 by 32 by 32, store 1 bit instead of a density value for 32 to the power of 3 points. So that's a really big saving, which is great. But as you get into, more advanced workflows, these low-hanging fruits kind of stop appearing. And you need to go into things like, maybe we can shave 2 bits of the transform positions we store for every vertex in the mesh data if we cleverly encode it like this. Or if we, maybe we can do a 8-bit quaternion for the normal instead of 3 16-bit components with a vector instead. And then we have to do another operation on the GPU, but we use less memory bandwidth. So things just become a lot more complicated once you get into the really low-level, high-speed stuff. So everything in the end comes down to data. Now, on a positive note, if we look at like a GTX 1080, I think memory throughput on that was something in the range of 200 gigabytes per second. And if we look at a 4080, we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 gigabytes per second. So that's a 3x increase, which is pretty neat. Hand in hand with that goes, unfortunately, that display resolutions have gone up quite dramatically over the same period. So that takes away some of that memory bandwidth. And then there's the fact that, great, over the last 10 years or so, we have had a 3x in memory bandwidth, which almost lets us double resolution. So I will leave the answer at that, just as food for thought. But the TLDR is, it's complicated, and the problems we need to solve in order to increase resolution and that sort of thing aren't bottleneck. Like, we're not going to get that fixed on a hardware level. We just need to continue to get smarter and smarter about the ways that we work with our data, so that we can do more with less. So that's where we're innovating. We're not waiting on the hardware to get faster, because that isn't happening fast enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is almost a scary thought.
I mean, if you consider how quickly the hardware has been getting faster, and the fact that it's just still not enough to keep up with a lot of the tech pushing that people are trying to do, that's interesting to consider. Mm-hmm. But in the end, the two always go hand in hand. And the moment you get more hardware, people will just go, okay, I can use that. And then they go, oh, but I didn't quite reach the benchmark I wanted to hit with this, so I guess I'll have to do some clever tricks now. So things get better and people hit a roadblock, and then they're like, oh, this wasn't what I wanted, and they'll just try harder.
Yeah. The endless cycle. So next question from Mr. Squarepeg. Although I know a few members of chat asked this, but they asked first, so they get the name call. Does Voxel Plugin 2.0 take advantage of world partition or the large world coordinate system in UE5?
We very intentionally don't take advantage of the large world coordinate system. I'll answer that one first because it's easy. As I mentioned, we're bottlenecked by data bandwidth. And what large world coordinates does is it goes from 32 bits per value to 64 bits per position value. So that doubles your data bandwidth needed to do the same computation. And since we are bottlenecked by memory bandwidth, that means that the moment you switch from a float to a double, you will just literally cut your generation speed in half. So, if not worse, depending on the context. Because if you're already like bottlenecked by that, then there's only so much you can do and things start swapping and it's dangerous. So don't do that. Anyway, point being, that's a tricky thing. So we don't support it. We intend to support something like it to make it easier for people to work with large worlds and like full-scale planets and that sort of thing. Our solution, in all likelihood, is going to be some sort of clever origin shifting node that we will implement under the hood, which like shifts positions around within the graph, because of how the graph framework works, we can fairly easily do that sort of thing. But it's going to be pretty complicated and there'll be trade-offs probably. The other thing, world partition, is... I mean, I'm assuming that that's along the lines of like the per file actor streaming and that sort of thing. We haven't really extensively played with that sort of thing. The voxel world is the voxel actor, it's called now. The voxel actor is a single entity. So like all of your meshing and stuff for the voxel world is a single thing. It's not splittable, which makes sense because it's procedural. So splitting it like that doesn't like work hand in hand with the guided procedural nature of how we do things. So by design, it's kind of incompatible. But then when you start thinking about how you use landmass brushes and that sort of thing within the context of your generators, you can start to think about, well, maybe we can like stream out landmass brushes in the distance if they're small. And because if you have more brushes in an area, that area will generate slower. So if you can remove small brushes from an area where you won't really see the difference much anymore, that will generate faster. So that is potentially an avenue to explore. In theory, the plugin should just work if you stream things out at a distance. The only like edge case that remains there is that things need to stream out before the chunk regenerates, basically. So like you need to coordinate ideally the LOD transitions of the terrain and when it regenerates with when you stream stuff in and out. But that's fairly doable, and even if you don't do that, like it won't be ideal, but there are still gains to be had just by doing it the naive way. So yeah, I mean, that shouldn't be an issue. We haven't tested it, but it should just work, because the moment the actor disappears, the voxel system goes, oh, okay, guess this actor doesn't exist anymore, so we don't need to generate it, and it just doesn't get accounted for anymore. With the downside, caveat there, being that if you don't coordinate it, if you just like remove an actor, that will regenerate the area that was in. So if you like have an LOD change and then remove the actor, then it'll just regenerate again right after you did so for the LOD change. So ideally, you probably do actually want to perfectly coordinate when you remove the actors with when you regenerate a chunk. So that's a little bit tricky, but realistically should be fairly doable. And when in doubt, to be conservative, I guess. I'll take note of that, and we'll look into whether we can find a nicer solution for that.
There we go. The next question that we've got is from Bryce Anderson, and they were wondering, can you spawn splines both additive and subtractive via graphs?
Currently, you can't spawn anything from the graph. We intend to support that. It's just something we haven't gotten around to because it poses a little bit of an architectural problem that we still need to address. Like, it's not a big thing. It's just something that in the big list of stuff that we need to do, it isn't a priority. If you need to spawn stuff procedurally, you can do that through blueprints. And if you decide that you need information for your graph in order to do that, then you can query stuff from your graph and then read that back on the gameplay stuff, and then spawn stuff from your game thread using that data, and then have the world regenerate, which is obviously not an ideal way of doing things, but it would work just fine. So to our view, the problem isn't like problematic enough. You can do what you would want to do already. It's just not the ideal workflow yet, and it'll come at some point, but not right now. That said, I do want to mention everything that I've shown works both at runtime and in editor. There, on the plugin side, there is effectively no distinction between in editor and runtime. Anything that works in one place will basically always work in the other, because with the way the plugin works, we just basically always need things to work in two places. So for instance, we don't support Nanite because we need things to work in both places, and we don't want to lock things to only working in editor. So we just don't support Nanite because it only works in editor. So that makes that problem very simple. So basically everything always works at runtime as well as in editor. So that offers flexibility. You can always do everything.
Awesome. The next question we've got is from James Gamble. Can you have selective areas of high detail? For example, say a high density or resolution voxel building within a lower density terrain, and can those be blended together?
Right now, no. There are. This is a gray conversation to have, because there are different ways to look at this. Because just because you mesh something at a given resolution doesn't mean that the data is calculated at a given resolution. So, for instance, you might, when you think about can I have high resolution data in a given area, you're probably thinking like meshing it at a low resolution in places where you don't need the extra detail. And realistically, that's not going to happen anytime soon, because it's just a tricky problem. Because you just run into all sorts of weird edge cases, both with the data management and with the actual meshing. But when you think about it from we want a consistent meshing resolution, which is quite high, but in a lot of cases, our data granularity is lower than that mesh resolution, that can be done just fine. Like, we don't support that yet, but we intend to support a zoom node, which effectively just lets you upscale your data by a factor 2, and you can do multiple of those in succession. And that means that you can say, in a given area, have a low-res base map, and then for specific areas, have a canvas, which overrides it with more high-resolution data. And that means that you have low-resolution data everywhere, which just gets upscaled to the meshing resolution, except in the places where you actually need stuff at the granularity of your meshing resolution, and then you just use a canvas to author at that resolution, with the caveat being that that'll be expensive, so you don't want to do that too much.
Fair. The next question is another one from Brace Anderson. They're wondering, will 2.0 support spawning nanite foliage assets?
It will. It doesn't yet. There are some things we need from Epic on that front, ideally. Well, there are some things we need from Epic. There are some answers we need from Epic, ideally. And in order to get those answers, we need to ask the questions. And in order to ask the questions properly, we need to do a bunch of research and like digging on the engine code to properly ask the questions. And we haven't had the time for that yet. So it's coming, but we need a bunch of background, which we don't have the time for right now. And then we need to wait on Epic to actually give us the information that we need to do it. So it's like a little bit away. So we also don't really have an interim solution for that. It's not like you can just like easily spawn an actor or something to replace it. It's just kind of don't use nanite foliage for right now. Just use placeholders. Sorry.
Understandable. So there's a few other questions, but just so I'm not having you sit here with us for 4 to 5 hours. I'll have this as our last one, and then hopefully, if you don't mind, you can give out maybe a good place for them to reach out to you if they have further questions
Yeah,
to
yeah,
ask.
of course. Yeah,
Awesome.
so I
So
mean,
the
the place
last
to find us,
question.
as always, is the Discord thing. Yeah, sure. You go. You do the question first, and then I'll direct people. That does make more sense.
Okay. The last question, we're going to end on a high note for this one. Not the tech guy is wondering, what feature or change are you most excited about with 2.0?
So this is actually a dumb answer, but I'm most excited about the backend. Because like we have so many cool features, but the reality is that none of these features could ever exist on 1.2, not because we couldn't make the features, but just because there's such a massive pain in the ass to implement on top of the foundation of 1.2. So like the landmass system is super cool, and I literally cannot fathom how you would architecturally stack it on top of 1.2. I just, it would be a nightmare. So the fact that 2.0 is as modular as it is and designed to be that modular and slotted together from the graph makes it so incredibly flexible that it can now do anything if you want it to. And if you needed to do something specific, you just write a simple node. So it's kind of a cop-out answer because effectively it comes down to everything. But it is, everything because you can now do everything, unlike before when you really couldn't. So, Fly, what's your take on that?
I mean, pretty much what you said, yeah. Like it's not like we can add a single feature to 2.0, like from 1.2 from 2.0. It's like, yeah, it's been a whole migration thingy. And so it's truly been everything.
And if you did have to pick
all
one?
the small I like the detailed texture very much. Like they really help.
Oh yeah,
It's
that
like the
makes
background
sense.
rendering.
For me, it's the foliage clusters. Like foliage clusters for me are just such a godsend. But it makes sense that for you it's detail textures. And I like how neither of us mention landmass, which is like the main thing we've been pushing for. Like, this is a world creation paradigm, super cool. And it's like, it is, but it's not that flashy. It's just nice. Whereas the others are really actually cool and game changing in the results.
I feel like that's fair. So I just because you're pushing the main features doesn't mean that it has to be your favorites.
Yep.
All right, well that wraps up the questions for our end, just again, so I'm not keeping you here all day. So what's a good spot for them to find you if they have other questions for y'all?
Yes. So people can go to discord.voxelplugin.com. I have that on the slide thingy. I mean, people can probably get there. It's not that hard. Realistically, if you just search Voxel Plugin, you'll end up on a website, and that in the top right has a link to our Discord, and then you'll be in the Discord. So if you actually want to ask us stuff, the Discord is by far the best place to be. We are quite active there. When it comes to 2.0, we have channels for like specifically, hey, I'm running into this weird issue, help me solve it, which is the 2.0 support channel. And then we have V2 feedback, which is for just playing around and talking about 2.0 and general discussion about it and helping each other out a bit more casually. And Fi and I are both very active in V2 feedback, especially at the moment, because it's just something that we're both very actively engaged in on a day-to-day basis, and we want to know how people feel about it. So if you want to talk about 2.0, that's the place to do it. And yeah, by all means, shoot all the questions you guys have there. We might not answer every single one of them, but I will definitely try.
There's only so many people who can answer at a time, but
yeah, it's always fun. You end up with just like this big list of questions, and then I just have this big list of my replies to the questions once I get on Discord in the morning. So yeah, that's fun stuff.
That's great. Rapid fire, All right. Well, with that, is there any final things that you want to make sure everyone knows about, or did y'all get everything out that you possibly could?
I think I've said plenty. I don't know if Fi has anything, but
I think only thing would be that all the stuff we showed today you can try for yourself. You can just grab the plugin downloader on the marketplace and you can download the 2.0 beta, try it for yourself.
assuming you own 1.2 on the marketplace.
Assuming you own 1.2.
That is an important caveat. Because the free version of 2.0 will come. It's just not quite there yet. Because we need it to actually be in a stable place and finished before we can start picking which features go in free and which ones don't. So,
For sure.
and as far as I'm aware, then that was all that we had to say.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much for coming on the show today. It was absolutely mind-blowing. I'm myself gonna have to go back and watch this stream over because there was just so much to absorb. It's incredible. So I cannot thank you both enough for coming on and showing us all of your hard work and demoing all these really cool features that you're going to be releasing.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. It's been a joy to be on.
And it's been a joy to have you on. And if you ever want to come back on in the future, I'm not opposed, but that's a discussion for later, I guess.
We will talk when we release 2.0.
There you go. You said it on stream, so that's basically a legal obligation at this point. So.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm fine with a legal obligation to talk when we release 2.0. That doesn't mean we have to do a stream. Anyway. Did I mention I also read the legal documents for Voxel Plugin? So.
Yeah, I can tell. Oh, dang it. Got me there. But thank you both so much.
Right.
And thank you, everyone who came to watch the stream as well. The show would not be what it is without you and your participation and your questions. So thank you all so much for coming and being part of our fun little community over here at Unreal Engine. We really appreciate it. If you missed any part of the stream, don't worry. That's okay. We post all of them on video format on demand on both our Twitch and our YouTube channel at Unreal Engine. You can also follow us at Unreal Engine on all social media, as well as come say hi in our forums where you can get the latest news and find all of the links associated with today's stream. Also, don't forget to check in next week because next week is going to be our big end of year review where we're going to be talking about all the cool and incredible things that we have done over this past year. It's going to be a big one. Make sure you're there. Don't miss it. There's a lot of work being put into it, and we really hope that you'll enjoy it. But yeah, with that, once again, thank you both so much, and we'll see all of you next week. Bye, everyone.
Cheers, guys.